Hello, my name is Allison Kaplan. I'm director of the May 4 Visitor Center. The center is located here at Kent State University at Taylor Hall on the 18-acre grounds of the National Historic Landmark Site, which marks the spot where Ohio National Guard shot upon students protesting the expansion of the Vietnam War on May 4, 1970. Protest is a part of Kent State's history, but it's not just limited to the past. Today, Kent State students continue to use their First Amendment right to speak out about issues they care about. Here at the Visitor Center, student tour guides ensure the story of May 4 lives on by sharing it with fellow students and visitors. Today, you'll tour through the center with some of those students, but it does not replace the experience of coming here and experiencing the historic site. So we encourage you to come in person and visit the May 4 Visitor Center.
Hello, my name is Sophie Swangle. Welcome to the May 4th Visitor Center, and I'm going to take you through our first gallery, which establishes the context for May 4th, both locally in Kent and nationally across America. Right now, I am surrounded by images from the Civil Rights Movement, which arose following World War II for equal rights between whites and blacks. And Kent State students were involved in the struggle from its earliest days. One of our own was one of the Freedom Riders. They were a series of protests against segregated buses, peacefully boarding those buses, and breaking the segregation laws. These protesters, however peaceful they were targeted by local police groups and local groups of the Ku Klux Klan as they happened throughout the South, resulting in results such as that right there. And it was a Kent State student named Danny Thompson, his mugshot is right here, who was arrested for buying a cup of coffee from the colored section of a Greyhound bus station. He was just one of many Kent State students who involved themselves in this political fight on a national level. Students were busing and carpooling down to Washington, D.C. to contribute in these large-scale protests that arose at this time to petition the government. But they were also involved very locally in bringing these issues home and confronting them in Kent. Kent State students sat in at segregated restaurants and protested the lack of fair housing for Black students off campus. And student groups such as Black United Students and Students for a Democratic Society made sure that those issues were issues that Kent State students cared about. These national occurrences were something that Kent State students could get directly involved in. Most notably, in 1968, the Oakland Police Department came all the way from California to recruit police officers on Kent's campus. They were the police department that targeted the Black Panthers and were extremely notoriously violent and racist. Kent State students did not stand for this, and the entire Black student body staged a mass walkout through the front gates. They petitioned the university to get Oakland off of their campus, and it was their actions that resulted in the establishment of our Africana Studies program and better representation in our faculty overall. So Kent State students from the very get-go were heavily involved in political activism. May 4th had the protests that occurred on May 4th had a definite precedent in their actions. Kent State students were engaging in a wider social phenomenon that emerged in America with the baby boomer generation that was born after World War II, growing up, attending liberal arts institutions and questioning their parents' ways. A lot of these students have been raised in white-collar suburbs, and they were raised on America as a bastion of democracy and the free world, but they were also realizing that many of the traditions that they had been born to were very conformist and limiting in what they wanted to do. And this spurs a burgeoning counterculture that would go on to essentially define the decade. This is the time of Woodstock, of the hippies, of psychedelic rock, of fringe jackets. It's an era of men growing their hair out and getting ridiculed by their parents. It's an age of divisive conversations and arguments over a dinner table, over world events, parents and their kids pitting themselves against each other. And it wasn't all flower power. Obviously, this is an age of political strife, but also assassinations. This age led to the emergence of voices like Martin Luther King Jr., Malcolm X, and Robert F. Kennedy. All three of those leaders were assassinated. So the youth are growing up in a very tumultuous time, and this is an age where they are experimenting with free expression. They're going to college, they're breaking away from their birth households, and they're exploring new ideas through their studies, connecting with others of their generation. The largest and most obvious proponent of this generation gap was the Vietnam War, which was raging throughout the 60s, a war that wasn't technically even a war. It hadn't been signed off by Congress. It's young people who are being targeted for the draft. This is the last American war to utilize the draft, which is weighing heavily on the minds of these young people. Going to college full-time and keeping a good GPA was one of the ways that one could get out of the draft. Yet also it was joining the National Guard. That was another avenue that young people took to avoid serving in Vietnam. The draft targeted young men, and socioeconomic factors led to poor people and Black men being targeted disproportionately. As you can see here on our chart, the December 1st, 1969 rollout of the draft attempted to make this process more equal by assigning a random number to birth dates. Everyone with the number 195 or below was called for duty. But these young men were more than just numbers. They were friends, boyfriends, sons, cousins, nephews. They're going to school. They're learning about the world for the first time. They're breaking out and letting themselves be defined by what they want to be defined by. And they don't want to be defined as a soldier, especially not one who is sent back home in a box. More and more students are protesting the war as it rages on, and on Penn State's campus specifically, they got quite creative with it, as evidenced by Bill Arfarel's protest that happened on April 21st, 1970, in the weeks building up to May 4th. He proclaimed in advance that he was going to napalm a dog outside of the Student Center, which was Oscar Ritchie Hall at the time. A crowd of angered people showed up at the front of the building, so enraged as to why anyone would do such a heinous act to a poor defenseless animal. But there was no napalm, there was no dog. It was just Bill giving a speech saying that the crowd, who was so incensed about what he said he was going to do, should be equally as mad about napalm, the chemical agent being used against innocent people, civilians, women, children in Vietnam, and that their government is sanctioning these cruel actions. And as more and more stories of this cruelty come out, more and more Americans of all age groups are turning against the war and questioning what their government is doing. You have the rise of television and mass media. This is the first war to be televised and live on television. It's being put directly in America's homes, and the death tolls are being rung up at the end of every night. And for the first time, Americans are able to almost immerse themselves in this war, and they're not liking what they're seeing. You have events specifically such as the My Lai massacre, a slaughter of a completely innocent Vietnamese village that was covered up for over a year and a half, being revealed to the public in November of 1969. More and more people are questioning, why are we continuing this war that has already been raging on for so many years? Is America trying to instill democracy via this fight, or are they just participating in the slaughter for no good reason? An end to Vietnam is something that America wants, and America elects President Richard Nixon, as he promised that he would be the one to end the war. That is until April 30th, 1970. On April 30th, Nixon announces live on television that America has spread the Vietnam War into the neighboring and neutral country of Cambodia, apparently to interfere with supply lines that would lead to a quicker end to the war. But Americans see through the hypocrisy of such a statement, and they are incensed. Protests arise throughout the country, and as we shall see, as I pass on this presentation to Brandon, Kent is going to be getting very heated in the next couple days as students react to this expansion of the war and use their First Amendment rights to speak out against it.
Hello, my name is Brandon Renner, and I'll be talking to you about the second gallery in our May 4th Visitor Center that will talk specifically about the days leading up to May 4th, and more specifically, the events on Kent State's campus that led up to what happened on that day. And where that kind of begins is on April 30th, 1970. And on this day, President Nixon goes onto national TV and he broadcasts to the country that the US military will be invading the Southeast Asian nation of Cambodia. And he frames this invasion as attempting to bring about the end of the Vietnam War faster than otherwise, but for most people in the country, justifiably so, they interpret it as essentially just an expansion of a conflict that's been going on for a very long time already. And one group of Americans who feel particularly betrayed by Nixon's invasion are those of the young American college-aged men and women in our country, because these people in 1970, most of them cannot vote. And so when President Nixon gets the presidency and is running on this campaign of, I have a secret plan to get us out of the war, they wanted to believe it, and so they feel this as kind of a betrayal. And although they cannot vote, what they can do is they can protest. And that's what this map right here shows. This shows the wide wave of protests we saw across the country on various college campuses and among different student bodies of those students who protested Nixon's invasion of Cambodia. And one of those campuses who protested, and many of its students, was Kent State. And that's where our story picks up on the morning of May 1st, 1970, where on that morning, students gathered just outside of Taylor Hall here, right in front of the building where our visitor center sits now. And they sit right at the Victory Bell in the Commons, and they say, hey, what Nixon did was unconstitutional. He went behind and above Congress to invade a country that we had no quarrel with, so the Constitution's dead, so we might as well bury it. And that's exactly what they do. They hold a funeral service for the Constitution right by the Victory Bell, they bury it underneath the bell, and they announce to everyone in attendance before they leave that before next week starts, they want to have another protest on May 4th for the exact same reason. So just keep that in mind as I'm talking about the events of these days, that there is a planned protest that is publicly known for the same exact reasons in 3 days. But that takes us to the end of the morning of May 1st, to the night of May 1st. And the night of May 1st is special for a couple reasons. One, it is one of the very first very warm weekends of the spring. And secondly, there's a playoff game in Kent that day. So people are in town for a reason. They want to be out on the town, and that's what people do that night. People are out at the bars, they're having a good time. And from what we know at the beginning of that night, it's fairly typical activity. No one feels in danger at all. From the reports that we do have, a couple trash cans do get turned over. One does get lit on fire from one report, but outside of that, nothing out of the ordinary. However, as the night goes on, some students start stopping cars and asking their opinion on Nixon and the invasion, no doubt because they're drunk and they probably protested earlier that day and already had it on their minds. And so the police see this, and in an attempt to avoid any further escalation, they say, hey, we're going to send everybody home, everyone out of the bars, just make sure this doesn't get worse. However, what that ends up doing actually is forcing everyone who was in the bars and off the streets all out into the road at once. And rather than stop this kind of demonstration that's forming, it just fuels it even more. It goes from maybe a handful maybe to a dozen people to tens up to 100 students that become a organized demonstration bordering on a riot. More police show up, which only fuels the demonstration by the students, which does turn violent to the extent of where multiple store windows in downtown Kent are broken, and a cop car's cruiser back window is smashed in by a beer bottle. And although this is broken up in the early hours of May 2nd, the citizens of Kent are very upset at this and they want the mayor to do something. And it was that kind of attitude that leads us into the morning of May 2nd. On the morning of May 2nd, not only are there feelings from the citizens and pressure on the mayor to do something about what happened the night before, but there are also circulating rumors around the campus that other radical activity might be being planned by student organizations. And although none of that ends up being founded, that pressure, along with the citizens, does convince the mayor to reach out to the National Guardsmen who are currently stationed in Akron on other business. And he calls them and says, hey, we want to put you on standby in case we need you, in case something happens over here. And the National Guard's response to that was essentially, okay, but you have to let us know by 5 p.m. today if you need us. So that kind of gave the mayor a clock from around 9 to 10 a.m. when that phone call happens to around 5 p.m. you have to decide. And during that time, it's about 7 to 6 hours. More rumors spread. The citizens are still upset. They haven't calmed down yet. And so because of that mounting pressure, he decides to meet that deadline and call the National Guard to arrive into Kent. Not Kent State campus specifically yet, but around 6 p.m. the National Guard do arrive in the city of Kent. And just about an hour to 2 hours later after they arrive, another student demonstration gathers at the Victory Bell in the Commons once again. This time, rather than staying at the Victory Bell, they march directly across the Commons to the ROTC building. And because of the nature of the ROTC building and its program, the Reserve Officer Training Corps, the building, not only at Kent, but at other college campuses in the country, was oftentimes seen as like the presence of the government embodied in one building. So when protests of these kinds broke out for other reasons, that was oftentimes a main focus, and that's what happens here on May 2nd. So on that night, the students march across the Commons, and they do attempt for a couple hours to light the building on fire, as it is very old and wooden, and would not take much to start if they were successful. However, these attempts for these few hours are completely unsuccessful. The fire department is called in relatively early on, and although the students do continue to attempt to, the fire department thwarts all real threats of that happening, so it really just appears to be a protest outside of the ROTC building. And then right around when that disperses, around 9 p.m., to this day we're not sure how or by whom, but after both parties have left thinking that it was over, someone is successfully able to ignite the building. And because, like I said, it is very old and very wooden, it does not take long for all of it to be engulfed in flames. And by the time the fire department is called back in to try to answer that fire and try to put it out, they realize there's nothing they can do. However, when the fire department comes back onto campus, they come back with a National Guard detail. And that's what you see in this picture right here. The National Guardsmen arrive onto the campus, and although the fire department does leave knowing they can't do anything, the National Guardsmen decide to stay in camp around the remains of the ROTC building for the night and for what they see as the foreseeable future. And that takes us into the morning of May 3rd. On the morning of May 3rd, like I said, students are now waking up to seeing essentially a military force stationed on their campus. And many of these students went to bed not knowing anything had happened. And so they're waking up, they're seeing troops stationed around the remains of a building they didn't even know get burned. They're seeing troops stationed outside of their dormitories, outside of their dining halls, outside of their lecture halls. And a lot of them just feel incredibly scared and incredibly nervous for what this might mean. And those nerves are only worsened by a press conference held later that morning. And this was held by the governor of Ohio, James Rhodes. And the reason James Rhodes is in Kent at this time is because in 1970, he is up for re-election. And he is running on a very kind of law and order, support the police, support the troops kind of campaign. And he sees the events that have happened in the few days before this in Kent as a way to further that agenda, a way to further that campaign. So he arrives into Kent in the early hours of May 3rd, and he holds a press conference. And in this press conference, he is intentionally inflammatory towards the students at Kent State, and he calls them, and I quote, the worst type of people that we harbor in America, and he vows to use any means necessary, including guns, to eradicate that problem. The students hear this, so now they feel like there's a real reason why they should be afraid, and the National Guardsmen hear this, who now feel empowered to some extent to do whatever they feel necessary to maintain order and deal with the problem, as Rhodes put it. So that only acts to rise up tensions, like I said, intentionally inflammatory. So that takes us now to the night of May 3rd, where for the third day in a row, there's another protest that gathers at the Victory Bell in front of Taylor Hall. But this time, not only is it against Nixon, but it is against the orders of James Rhodes, and it is against the presence of the National Guardsmen on their campus. And this time, they march from the Victory Bell all the way to the front corner of Kent campus at the intersection of Lincoln and Main, where they hold a sit-in across Main Street. And it is their goal of this sit-in to bring demands to the National Guardsmen, such as leaving or ensuring their safety. And at first, from the reports that we have of that sit-in, the National Guardsmen are completely receptive to communicating with the students. There seems to be a good back and forth. So much so that at some point during that sit-in, the students feel so confident that they are safe and that they are going to be heard by these National Guardsmen and by the law enforcement there, that they actually start to move off of the sit-in. They start to leave willingly. However, it is the reports that we have that once the students started to do this, the National Guardsmen ceased communication, and shortly after, fixed bayonets, fired tear gas into the students' crowd, and not only forced them off of the road that they were partially still on, but off of front campus entirely. There are many reports of students hiding in the library for safety, knowing that they weren't safe to go out there or afraid to face them. And many of these students who hid did not leave until local police departments came and took over for the National Guardsmen, that they felt safe enough to leave. And it was during this confrontation that 2 students were stabbed by bayonets. Thankfully not mortally. But that has now now we see a culmination not only of students of some kind to this day we don't know who on May 2nd igniting the building, but now a very real confrontation from the National Guardsmen against the students in a violent way. And that is all the context that leads us into the morning of May 4th, where, like I said on May 1st, there's a planned protest that's supposed to take place. People know about this, the National Guardsmen know about this, the students know about this, and all of this turmoil and all of this tension is leading us into the morning of May 4th. And with that, I'm going to turn you over to my colleague Emma to talk about that day more in detail.
Hi, my name is Emma. I work at the May 4 Visitor Center, and I have for the past 4 years. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about how the day of May 4 went down. Basically, over the weekend of May 1st, students agreed to stage a protest on Monday, May 4. Classes went on as usual, so this was just kind of in the midst of the day. They agreed to meet at noon. So students started gathering around 11:30 a.m. Also, an important thing to mention around this time was that Black United students, which had a major presence on campus, agreed to not partake in this protest because they felt that if they were present, things might get violent quicker. So Black United students was not present at this protest. But yeah, students start gathering around 11:30 up on the Commons and by the Victory Bell. So as the students are protesting, the guard begins to advance towards them. Also around this time, the guard starts throwing tear gas. They start, and students start throwing rocks. So basically just kind of back and forth at each other. Some guardsmen throw rocks back at the students. And then the guard begins to advance towards the students, which sends the students who are on the hill, they then go around both sides of Taylor Hall and end up on the other side over in the parking lot of Taylor Hall. So basically just over the hill. The guardsmen end up at the top of the hill aiming down into the parking lot of students where the protest keeps going, keeps being very vocal. And then after a few minutes is when the guardsmen open fire into the group of students, which ends up wounding 9 students and killing 4. The reason we have so much information about the timing of the shooting and so many photos are because one student put a recorder in his dorm window and recorded audio of the entire event. So there is detailed audio. There's detailed audio of the entire shooting. And then the reason there's so much photography is because there were a lot of photography classes going on in Taylor Hall around the time of the shooting. So a lot of students went outside to take photos of the protest and capture that, which is why you see so much in here. But after the shooting takes place, guardsmen shot about halfway down the hill and also into the parking lot. After that takes place, the guards retreat back to their original position, and then students are left basically to deal with the aftermath. So students start trying to help the wounded, ambulances come in, and chaos ensues. After a little while though, once all that is kind of taken care of, some students go back to the hill to stage a sit-in to then protest that the shooting actually took place. And then because this was happening, the guardsmen were still aiming and ready to fire. And the only reason the students ended up dispersing is because faculty marshals at the time basically begged and pleaded with them to leave, or else more people would be hurt or killed. So that is basically what comes of May 4 on this day. The campus is closed pretty much about an hour after the shooting takes place, and it does not open back up until the summer semester.
After the shooting, reaction is immediate. Students are told to get home however they can and campus shuts down. Some people, if you don't have cars, are being taken on buses to the biggest, nearest cities, and some people are just walking out. The reaction in town is of fear and mistrust, and the entire world is hearing about this. We have telegrams from Switzerland, South Africa, and Greece that are solidarizing themselves with our students. Some parents only hear what happens when their kids are showing up at their doorsteps and saying, "Hey, I'm sorry I had to come home early, kids got shot." 2,500 colleges are protesting also in solidarity because students are looking at themselves as one big unity that is being threatened by the people that are supposed to protect them. Because Kent State isn't isolated, right? Violence is being used to repress protests all over the country for a while now. One of the biggest ones is Jackson State, when Philip Gibbs and James Green are killed in reaction with police brutality and racial violence during a protest. Whichever side you were on before May 4, most people can now agree that it shouldn't have happened, and this is the day that the war came home. All of this bubbling energy leads to very observable change. The polls entirely pivot. A lot of people that were pro-war are now anti-war. The troops withdraw from Cambodia not long after May 4, and in 1975, the war in Vietnam comes to an official end. A couple of things happen in terms of Congress and legislature. The 26th Amendment passes, which now lets 18-year-olds vote. It's one of the most important changes that happens, and civil power is granted to the kids that before only really had protest as an outlet. Another thing is that now officials that are responding to protests no longer can bring lethal weaponry, so bayonets or any kind of real bullet, anything that can kill you after one blow. So nowadays, if they can't bring any kind of weaponry like that to a protest response, that is a direct consequence of the people that were speaking out against it on May 4 in 1970 in general. In the legal sphere, the students that were wounded and their parents and family members take the Ohio Guardsmen and Governor Rhodes to court. It initially is barred under the 11th Amendment, which stops civilians from being able to prosecute state officials acting in this official capacity under federal court. But it ends up passing in the Supreme Court and drags on for over 10 years. It only then gets settled out of court for two main outcomes. Over $600,000 is given to the students and their families as financial reparation, most of which goes to Dean Kaler, who got shot in the spine and is officially permanently paralyzed, so that he can afford his medical bills and any adaptations that he might need to his home. The second thing is a statement of regret. This is a document that is signed by all of the Ohio Guardsmen and Governor Rhodes, and it just says that it shouldn't have happened and it shouldn't have happened in this way. This is not an apology or an admission of responsibility or guilt in any way. And to this very day, no one has been officially charged with commanding the shooting or with the shooting itself. No one is found guilty.
Thank you for watching our tour of the May 4 Visitor Center. We hope that you learned something. And if you want to learn more about May 4, please consider exploring our website. The Kent State University Library special collections about May 4 are digitized on their website. And you can even come explore in person our National Historic Landmark site. We would also enjoy if you would consider making a donation to the May 4 Visitor Center Student Internship and Programming Fund. Thanks again for watching and have a great day.